Greetings. This is Dr. Charles Greenawalt from the Government Department at Millersville University, and this is Canadian Government and Politics. We are happy to welcome you back to Video from the Ville. Videos from the Ville. We will be looking at all the different aspects of Canadian government and politics throughout the course of this semester. You've already seen the orientation, so let's move on to Canadian geography. We find that Canada, of course, is probably is America's most important ally, and in many ways is America's most misunderstood foreign neighbor for being the country that is most important to America. Americans know so very little about Canada. Let's start with Canadian geography. You find that most Canadian schoolgirls and schoolboys will know all 50 American states and all 50 American state capitals. You find very few American school children will know the Canadian provinces and the Canadian provincial capitals. You want to be following along with me on your PowerPoints that I've sent to you, and you'll find that you want to go to the PowerPoint on Canadian geography. You find that you have a worksheet there after we take a look at Niagara Falls and Horseshoe Falls, one of the most beautiful sights in the world. Then you go to a worksheet that asks you, I'd like you to run that off and see how well you do. If we had person-to-person classes this semester, this is the thing I would do at the end of the first class. I would hand this out to you and ask you to please do your best to complete the Canadian provinces and the Canadian territories and the provincial and territorial capitals and see how well you knew them at this point. Not expecting perfection by any rate, but just trying to gauge your knowledge of Canada at this point. Well, if you go to the next PowerPoint slide, you'll find that there is a completed map of Canada with all the provinces and provincial capitals labeled and all the territories and territorial capitals labeled. Let's just quickly go through them from east to west and make sure that you know them, because I'm going to ask you to commit them to memory. I want you to memorize them so that if I see any of you on campus, or we're on the phone together, or we're on FaceTime together, or we're Zooming in my office hours together, I would perhaps be able to stop and ask any one of you what the provincial territory of British Columbia is, and you would know Victoria. Or I'd ask you what the territorial capital of the Northwest Territories would be, and you would know Yellowknife. So I would like you to commit those to memory. There aren't very many, so it's not a huge task. But let's go to the very east. The easternmost province, of course, is Newfoundland. Of course, only joined the Confederation in 1949. And we find Newfoundland and Labrador. The provincial capital is St. John's at the easternmost tip of the province. Then, of course, you have Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia's provincial capital, of course, is Halifax. Then you have New Brunswick, which is right south of Nova Scotia, and Fredericton is the territorial capital there. Of course, we also have out in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we have Prince Edward Island, PEI, and PEI's territorial capital is, of course, Charlottetown. Then as we go west, we have the huge province of Quebec. And Quebec's provincial capital is Quebec City. Then we go to another behemoth among the provinces of Canada, and of course that's Ontario. The provincial capital of Ontario is Toronto. As we continue west, then we have Manitoba. Of course, Manitoba's territorial provincial capital is Winnipeg. Just west of Manitoba is Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's provincial capital, of course, is Regina. Just west of Manitoba is Alberta. Alberta's provincial capital is Edmonton. Just west of there is British Columbia. British Columbia's provincial capital, as we said a moment ago, is, of course, Victoria. The territories, we can start, let's go east to west again. The easternmost territory is Nunavut. Nunavut was formed several years ago when the Canadian government took the Northwest Territories and split them into two. Nunavut was devoted to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and its territorial capital is Ilquat. After that, and going to the west, we have the Northwest Territories. That was the western half of the old Northwest Territories, and its territorial capital is Yellowknife. West of there is the final territory of Canada, and of course that is the Yukon. And the Yukon's territorial capital is Whitehorse. So that is the organization, geographic organization of the Canadian nation. And as I said, I ask that we please memorize that. It shan't take long. Okay, let's go on. In your PowerPoint, you'll find that the next thing we want to do is note the very important book on Canadian geography. When we're talking about Canadian geography, there's a great book by Andrew Malcolm. Andrew Malcolm wrote a number of years ago a book called The Canadians. And in The Canadians is this fantastic chapter, and it's just called Geography. And it's all about Canada's geography. I'd like you to take a look at that if you ever search out that book, perhaps for research purposes. But he talks about the Canadian geographic position in the world, and I love his quote that I've included here in your PowerPoint about Canada's place in the world. He says Canada is, quote, a brooding geographic colossus. A brooding geographic colossus, immense, hostile, forbidding, and unforgiving of those who ignore natural rules of survival, unquote. A brooding geographic colossus, immense, hostile, forbidding, and unforgiving to those who ignore natural rules of survival. You have to remember that Canada is the second largest country in the world, of course surpassed only by Russia, with its huge dimensions that it has in Siberia. Well, what are the dimensions of Canada? How does it look? Andrew Malcolm tells us that Canada is a distorted parallelogram. It's 4 million square miles of land and water. It's the second largest country in the world, as I said a moment ago. The span between east and west is 4,545 miles. 4,545 miles. And 25%, 1/4 of all the world's time zones are contained here. The south-north span, the distance between south and north, is almost 3,000 miles. Almost 3,000 miles further than the distance between New York City and Los Angeles. So if you can believe that those distances, the distance between the northernmost point and the southernmost point of Canada is 3,000 miles further than the distance between New York City and Los Angeles. Some Canadian lakes, the lakes are larger than states in the United States. You find one Canadian forest is 6 times larger than the nation of France. J.M. Careless is a very important Canadian historian. He's written extensively on Canadian history and Canadian affairs, and you can find his work as you do your research. He says, interesting quote about geography. Quote, Canadian history largely records a struggle to build a nation in the face of stern geographic difficulties, unquote. Canadian history largely records a struggle to build a nation in the face of stern geographic difficulties. You find that Canada has the world's longest coastline, and it indeed is a unique frontier among all the industrialized and developed countries of the world. You find that Canada's frontier is quite unique because of the long, extensive coastline. Perhaps the most prominent feature of Canadian geography, which stands out quite a bit, is the Canadian Shield. As Careless says, it's the most prominent geographic feature of Canada. It is a huge mass of elemental. It's a huge mass of elemental bedrock, and it swings across the country from Quebec through northern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories. There was not any highway that was able to penetrate it until 1943. The Canadian Shield is over 700 million years old, and Jacques Cartier, who had found it, stumbled upon it in 1534, said, quote, I am rather inclined to believe that this is the land that God gave to Cain, because it's so inhospitable. Yes. He just said, I'm rather inclined to believe that this is the land that God gave to Cain, unquote. I added, because it's so inhospitable. And then the next PowerPoint you have is a picture of the Canadian Shield on the right and a map of the Canadian Shield on the left that shows you how it sweeps out of Quebec south and then west up into Manitoba and the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. Okay. Well, another Canadian writer, Hugh McLennan. Hugh McLennan has written one of the most famous books about Canada, and it's called Two Solitudes. Two Solitudes. He believes that Canada's two solitudes, one is English and one is French. And he believes that the geography of Canada has made it less of a homogeneous nation and waters down any sense of a common identity. So Canadian geography, he believes, is responsible for making it more heterogeneous instead of homogeneous and giving it less of a common identity. He believes that really the best way to portray Canada is a conservative collection of regional solitudes. A conservative collection of regional solitudes that are separated from one another by formidable national barriers. We find that the most serious barriers, of course, would be distance and size. Distance and size. We find that, of course, Canada is so huge that it has made the population density of Canada lower than the population density of Saudi Arabia. That is very difficult for many people to comprehend. Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide in the PowerPoint presentation. We take a look at the size and the distances that are involved with Canadian geography. When we look at the width of Quebec, just the width of Quebec from east to west, it's the same distance of going from New York City to Omaha, Nebraska. That's just one province of Canada. You find that if you're going to drive between Toronto, the capital of Ontario, and go to Winnipeg, the provincial capital of Manitoba, it's going to take 36 hours of drive time, consecutive drive time, 36 hours. Find that when we look at the Great Lakes, and many people are surprised by this, you find that 8 states in the United States, 8 American states, touch the Great Lakes. We find on the northern side of the Great Lakes there's only one Canadian province that touches the Great Lakes, and that is Ontario. The smallest Canadian province, of course, would be Prince Edward Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But even though it's the smallest Canadian province, it's still twice as large as the smallest American state, which is Rhode Island. Texas, which is always, of course, the largest of the states in the lower 48, you find that Texas could easily fit within Quebec, could easily be stuck into Quebec, and there would be room left over for Connecticut and for Delaware. And of course, we know the historical and the cultural links between Quebec and France, but you find that three nations of France could fit into Quebec. Quebec could accommodate 3 Frances within it. That's how large Quebec is. Well, we take some of the other geographic entities. We could take Yukon, then the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, the territories of Canada. And they are larger than Germany. So Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut is larger than Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Austria, Spain, Portugal, and all of New England, and the Middle Atlantic states thrown in. That's how large, again, Canada and its geography really are. Well, let's take a look at another Canadian writer, Northrop Frye, F-R-Y-E. Northrop Frye, F-R-Y-E. He's a Canadian writer, and he tells us that the fundamental question for at least English Canadians is not who am I, but where is here. So he believes the most fundamental question for English Canadians is not who am I, but where is here. He believes that Canada has mostly been settled by immigrants who move directly from abroad to their settlement. It's not like you have in the United States where immigrants will came in the past and may have landed at New York, and they moved across the heartland of the United States, wave by wave, going from place to place. No, in Canada, they would land and move directly to where they wanted to settle. Find in Canadian immigration did not move in successive waves across the country as it did in the United States. Find that in Canada, the immigrants maintained stronger ties to their homeland than was true in the United States during the 19th and the 20th century. We find many Western Canadians came up from the American West. They had opportunities to buy land or to acquire land in Canada, so they moved up from Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and so forth, and moved up into Canada. Find that Canadian geography, most importantly, it discourages nationhood. It discourages nationhood, and it encourages strong ties to the neighboring regions of America. So you have the Western Canadian provinces having strong ties to the Western American states, and you find that the Eastern Canadian provinces, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, they have always had strong relationships to New England. Well, let's take a more in-depth look at the different regions as we go along. Let's start out with the Maritimes. First of all, what are the Maritimes? The Maritimes are considered to be New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. Initially, you find now that Newfoundland and Labrador, one province, are considered to be part of the Maritimes as well. But originally, the Maritimes were considered to be Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. And you find that in Canada was created formed in 1867. And you find that all of these Maritimes in 1867 opposed the formation of Canada. They opposed the formation of Canada. And you find in 1876, indeed, Nova Scotia's legislature passed legislation to secede from Canada. As I said a moment ago, the Maritimes are tied closely to New England, and the exodus of the Loyalists after the Revolutionary War from America, many of them simply came to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. It was nearby, and you could then reclaim your connection to the crown. Now you find that these 4 Atlantic provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, you find that these 4 Atlantic provinces are 6 times the size of Maine. They're 6 times the size of Maine. The Maritimes, however, only comprise 40% of the nation's provinces, but only 10% of the nation's population. And they represent only 6% of the land area, the land mass that we have for Canada. As I said a moment ago about Newfoundland, Newfoundland turned out to be Great Britain's first overseas colony. It was a protectorate of the United Kingdom going into Canada in 1949. It traditionally has the nation's highest unemployment rate and its smallest per capita income. You find that Nova Scotia is about 6 times, not Nova Scotia, excuse me, Newfoundland about the same size as Tennessee. And you find that Newfoundland is closer to Liverpool, England, than it is to Toronto. So when you're in St. John's, the provincial capital of Newfoundland, as I've been several times, you are closer there to Liverpool, England, than you are to Toronto, Ontario. You find in the next PowerPoint slide some very nice slides of Newfoundland. Very nice pictures, and a map again of Newfoundland, which is comprised of Labrador and Newfoundland. We move on to Quebec. Quebec is the largest province in geographic size, and it's the second largest in population. It is the ancestral home of the French Canadians, and about 25%, or 1/4, of all Canada's population lives in Quebec. We find that the location of Quebec City and the location of Montreal are all decided by the rapids in the St. Lawrence River. As explorers moved upstream, they moved through the Gulf of St. Lawrence and up into the St. Lawrence River. You find that they had to get out of the river and portage around the rocks and the rapids in 2 spots that now became very famous cities, Quebec City and Montreal. Well, Ontario, we move on to Ontario. We find that it is the manufacturing homeland, the manufacturing heartland, I should say, for the country. It's the most populous of the provinces. More people live here than anywhere else. And you find that Ontario also serves is a very important corn belt to raise corn and other agriculture for the country of Canada. You find here in Ontario is where the national capital is located. Ottawa. Ottawa was chosen to be the capital by Queen Victoria, even though she had never visited Canada. And it serves as a compromise between the English and the French. The French who are on one side of the Ottawa River and the English who are on the other. We find that Andrew Malcolm, described Ottawa at the time when the Queen designated it as the national capital. He described it as a plain, old, cold canal town. A plain, old, cold canal town. Hardly the capital, what we would later imagine as the lively capital of a growing and booming country. Well, Toronto, in fact, was established on the site of an old Indian winter camp. It had been called York, but York was burned to the ground by the British during the War of 1812. By the Americans. York was burned to the ground by the Americans during the War of 1812. You find that Toronto is home to one of every 8 Canadians, and Toronto at this point is the capital of Canadian publishing. Not only Canadian publishing, but Canadian culture, Canadian business, Canadian finance, and Canadian communications. We find that Toronto is a huge city, probably 244 square miles large. Well, this moves us to Quebec. We find that Quebec, of course, contains the city that was once considered to be the premier city of the North American continent, and that was Montreal. Montreal then went from being the premier city of North America to being the premier city of Canada. We find that only recently has Toronto surpassed Montreal in national importance. Montreal is the second largest French-speaking city in the world, only surpassed by Paris, of course. But you find that Montreal, instead of being the nation's perhaps most important city, is now a city of regional importance. So, one different way to look at it. We have some slides with pictures of Toronto with the CNN Tower, once the largest, tallest man-made structure in the world, no longer. And then you have an aerial shot of Quebec City, and there you have featured in the middle the Chateau Frontenac, which is a lovely hotel that was built by the Canadian railway system. We go out to the other regions. We go west to Alberta. Alberta is a province that was named for Queen Victoria's daughter. You find that in February of 1947, Imperial Oil finally struck oil. They had 133. They had tried to find oil 133 times. They had 133 dry holes. And finally, in February of 1947, Imperial Oil of Canada struck oil. Canada, we find, is 80% energy independent, and it could be completely energy independent if it simply developed its hydro resources. There's so much running water there, and if that was tapped, Canada, of course, would be completely energy independent. All Canadian provinces control their own natural resources. This is a bit different than in the United States. The natural resources of Canada are not controlled by the national government in Ottawa. Each province controls its own natural resources. This is part of what we call asymmetrical federalism. that yes, Canada has a federal system, but the powers of the different parts of the Federation vary from province to province. And we go on to British Columbia, last region of Canada. Find that it is the first Canadian region that considered independence at one point, and that was a leverage tool to convince the Eastern Canadians to agree to finish the Transcontinental Railway. If the United States had a transcontinental railway, so could Canada, and it would help tie the East and the West together. And Eastern Canadians agreed, and that was a condition that fixed British Columbia within the Canadian Dominion. So the Trans-Canadian Railway was built to link British Columbia with Eastern Canada. Find that many people don't realize what's so important in British Columbia are the forest industry and the forest products. Forest covers 2/3 of all of British Columbia. Find that British Columbia also has extensive deposits of coal, gas. Of course, they rely on fisheries and agricultural resources, specifically lots and lots of orchards up and down the coast because of the climate. Vancouver is the largest seaport on all of the west coast of North America, and Vancouver is actually 350 miles closer to Tokyo than it is to Halifax. Just like that comparison between Liverpool and St. John's and Toronto. British Columbia's population is all clustered in the southern part of the province, clustered along the American border. Well, let's look at the other Canadian regions besides British Columbia. Let's look at the territories very quickly. Yukon. Yukon is actually much larger than most Americans believe. It's the size of 5 Commonwealths of Pennsylvania. We find that 21 of its mountains are more than 2 miles high. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? But yet it only has fewer than 40,000 people. So you have 5 Pennsylvanias being able to fit into Yukon, but it only has about the same number. It has fewer people than are found in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. It has less than 3,000 miles of road and less than 150 miles of paved road. The city of Dawson, of course, which was very famous in mining circles and in the Yukon Gold Rush, could only be reached by steamboat until the 1950s. Of course, we also have the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and these territories represent 1/3 of the total size of Canada. 1/3 of the total size. You find that if you're traveling by air, it takes 2 full days to travel from east to west across the vast expanse of the Canadian territories. But this is just across the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. Okay, we have some pictures in here of the different territorial capitals for you to take a look at. And lastly, just a quick word about economic geography, because we're going to have a whole section on the Canadian economy coming up a little bit later. But you find that economic geography in Canada is simply a reflection of physical geography. Canada is a collection of regions, and these regions are physically separate, but of course they're separated by such distance that they're psychologically separate as well. And Canada has never been equipped well to cope with these distances and with this separation. So Canada has always struggled with the settlement pattern that it's had. Work skills of the population are usually linked closely to the individual economies of the home regions. We find that provinces each have their own legislature, and the territories, of course, also have their own territorial legislatures. And those legislatures have generally passed measures against other provinces' population moving in to their province and working without proper certificates and proper permits. Generally, what they want to do is they want to establish that the skills you have are needed in the province and that there's a job there waiting for you. Find that many people consider the cornerstone of the Canadian Confederation, which has been the government's aim over many generations to try to equalize the disparity, the economic disparity among the different regions of Canada. And this is called the social contract of the Confederation. And of course, this is why today you see so many of the people from Newfoundland who were involved with fisheries who live in Alberta now and work in the oil industry. But this is the social contract of the Confederation, the government's aim to equalize the disparity among the country's different regions economically. And that will conclude this initial section on geography. Let's wrap this up, and I'll see you back here for the next session on Canada. Tune in and when you have time to get the next lecture.